She, not completely, she's just like, oops. In what way? Because you have, there's typically there's not a set workshop. I'll do it the same way I have before, so we'll do what we've done budgets before with me as the mayor. Same, yeah. You forgot, go ahead, yeah. Yeah, so no, we'll do the, like the normal way that I do it, and then there'll be the presentation. I'll ask everyone to hold their questions until after the presentation. Then we'll do comments and questions, because there's not gonna be really any motion or anything.
Right.
So we'll take comments and questions at the same time. I'm gonna ask for 5, yeah. Yes,
Okay, that's where I wanted to understand.
yeah, because there's no motion and it's a budget, we should have a little more time, yeah. Hmm? Okay. You ready? Jennifer, do we have Leslie on the line? She's okay. Hold on.
Good
Jennifer,
afternoon, I'm present.
I could hear you, Mayor Pro Tem.
No, how are you? I think I see you
I'll
smiling.
ask later where you're at.
Excuse me?
I'll ask later where you're at.
I'll tell you.
all right,
Text me.
good evening. Today is Tuesday, June 14, 2022. The time is 5 p.m. and the adjourned special meeting of the following will come to order. The Victorville City Council and the same council also sitting as the Victorville Library Board of Trustees, Southern California Logistics Rail Authority, Southern California Logistics Airport Authority, successor agency to the Redevelopment Agency, the City as Housing Assets Successor, Joint Powers Financing Authority, and the Victorville Water District. Madam Clerk, will you kindly call the roll?
Councilmember Becerra,
Present.
Councilmember Gomez. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Irving,
Present.
Mayor Jones.
Here.
We have quorum.
Thank you. And just so that everyone's aware, Mayor Pro Tem Irving is attending via Zoom. All right, this evening we're going to have our invocation by Pastor Paul Gostanian of High Desert Church, and then that'll be followed up with the Pledge of Allegiance by Captain John Wickham. Good evening and welcome, Pastor. Will everyone please stand if you're able?
Thank you for having me. And thank you for your service. Let's pray together. Well, Father, we thank you for each and every one of the council members here today. We thank you for their service and their work and the staff here in the city of Victorville. We pray, I pray just a protection over them. Pray that you would help their minds continue to understand all of the complexities related to running a city. Even today with a budget meeting, I pray that they would have understanding, ask good questions. Thank you for the continued safety that you've provided this city and actually continue to do so. We just give you all the glory. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Like of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you very much, Pastor and Captain Wickham. All right, Madam Clerk, will you kindly present the agenda and any revisions thereto?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. We have revisions to agenda item number 1 today. The revised pages 11 through 17 as available resources are replaced in their entirety. And you have a copy of that at the dais, and the public has a copy at their cadenza.
All right, thank you. Any conflict of interest by council members? Hearing and seeing none, we're going to go ahead and move on to the introduction to public comments. Madam Clerk, before we do that, are there requests to speak?
Yes, Madam Mayor.
Okay, with that said, let's see, we'll welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Victorville City Council. Your city council is interested in your ideas and opinions and furthermore endeavors to incorporate them into its deliberations. At the same time, the council must be able to carry out its business in an organized and efficient manner free from material disruption. Therefore, this meeting will be administered in accordance with the council's established policies and procedures and Government Code Section 54957.9. All testimony during this special meeting is limited to items posted on the agenda and must be directed solely to the council. Individual speakers may address the council once per public comment period and once per each public hearing item for up to 3 minutes. Additional time may be allocated for appeal hearings, none of which we have tonight. And those who desire to comment on a public hearing item can always reserve their remarks until that public hearing item has been heard. Although open meeting laws do not permit council members to engage in dialogue with any speaker during the public comment periods, please know your comments and questions may be taken into consideration by council members when discussing the particular agenda item. The presiding officer may briefly respond or have staff respond to statements or questions, or may request that the staff report back to a council at a subsequent meeting. Speakers are requested to comment as briefly as the subject permits. Individual council members who speak as a member of the public do so without the semblance or presumption of authority derived from her public office and are subject to the same meeting rules of conduct and decorum as other public participants. Whether attending this meeting in person or via Zoom, once comments are invited, the speaker will be called on by name, then recognized by the presiding officer. The speaker will state the item number to be addressed, and this evening it's only item number 1. Audience members may not disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of this meeting, and those who do are subject to removal from the meeting pursuant to Penal Code 403. Your understanding and cooperation are appreciated. All right, Madam Clerk, can we have our first speaker from in chambers?
Yes, our first speaker is Mary Ann, and she wishes to speak about capital improvement projects.
Thank you. Good evening, Mary Ann. So as it relates to the budget capital improvement projects, thank you. Welcome again.
Thank you. I'm here again to remind you of the death of Sam Garland, who was struck and killed on April 4th of this year at the intersection of Mojave Drive and Condor Road. This intersection, according to your online public budget, heading capital investment projects, streets continued, page number 107, is shown as one of several intersections slated to have new traffic signals installed, utilizing funds from funding source street lighting, fund project number 200-62053, and funding source measure I, funding project number 250-62053, for a combined total cost of $167,000. I respectfully request that when considering approval for this fiscal year 22-23 capital investments projects, as specifically concerning traffic lights, blinking yellow lights, reflective painted crosswalks, and the like, that you remember Sam and so many others who have lost their lives or been injured, as pedestrians on the unfriendly streets of Victorville and vote to approve these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Madam Clerk.
There are no additional in-chamber speakers, and I have no speakers via Zoom.
Okay, so that concludes our in-chambers request to speak. Can you go ahead and set the timer, Madam Clerk, for 30 seconds in case someone in our Zoom audience is trying to queue up to speak?
Madam Mayor, 30 seconds has lapsed, and I have no speakers.
All right, thank you. Then the chair goes ahead and closes the public comment period. And we're going to move on to our first business in order, which is written communications, beginning with our item number 1. And this is, the fiscal year 2022-2023 budget workshop. And on this item, Mr. Metz, I understand you're going to be doing a presentation.
That's correct.
Okay, so council members, you have before you a hard copy of the presentation that's going to be offered tonight. And so I would ask you to make notes and hold your questions until the conclusion of the presentation. And because there's going to be no motion expected for this evening, it's a workshop. The chair is going to go ahead and ask for questions and comments at the same time, and that will allow for 5 minutes per council member. All right, Mr. Metzler.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. And also thank you to the public first for working with us. Just over the course of last week, we had actually originally intended for this budget workshop to be last week. But it's a big budget. There's a lot of work that goes into this. And last week, we just weren't as confident about the presentation then as we are now. And so certainly the presentation that we bring to you tonight is our first opportunity to review with you, also to interpret what's really contained in this larger 160 plus or minus page document. What this budget proposes, and I say that because as this is our first time with the council, this is staff's proposal based upon our interpretation of policy and considering previous direction. It's a presentation that doesn't go into the level of detail as your binder does, but we're certainly prepared to speak to it. But it does speak to this budget on a high level with enough information that we believe provides you with enough information about what this budget is intending to do over the course of the next fiscal year. And the next fiscal year, for those that aren't familiar, the next fiscal year for us starts July 1st and ends June 30th of 2023. So that is our budget year. And so with that, we always start out by recognizing those that are involved in this process. And first, it's recognizing you as the city council. And really, when it comes to the budget, you're effectively the policy making team. And that includes all 4 members of our council. And I would characterize this policy that you're making as the most important recurring policy making decision you make on an annual basis. As this really effectively serves as our framework for the goods and services that we're going to provide to our community in the upcoming year. The way we're structured here is it's the council's role to establish policy, and you rely on myself along with my executive team to help execute on that policy. So beyond myself, you've got Deputy City Manager Sophie Smith and Deputy City Manager Janelle Davidson. They help me execute that policy. And then, of course, responsible for representing us on legal matters to the extent there are legal issues. You do have your city attorney, Mr. Andre Dvornowski, which is your city attorney. Beyond that, it's a big team, and this budget doesn't get put together without the efforts of your leadership team, which I've laid out in this particular slide. But I think what's most important is those that are actually doing the heavy lifting, those that were here largely Friday night until 10 or 11 o'clock, as an example, and even on Saturday again, assembling this document and making sure the numbers connect and the numbers are correct, and we're able to print something that's actually something that we're proud of. And that team is largely, and I have to give thanks, of course, to the finance team, which is Kim Scott, Tony Camargo, who works in my office, but works very closely with that finance team. Rick Flincham, who I saw walk in. Thank you, Rick, for being a part of the effort. Nikisha Blewett, and also Lazaro, I believe I saw as well here in the audience. Actually, they're all here in the audience, I should say. So thank you particularly, because those folks, in addition to John Mendiola leading that effort, they're the ones that have done the real heavy lifting, bringing us to this point. And so with that, I start out with a message similar to what we shared last year, and I've modified it a little bit. But I think it's important to recognize before we go into this document that we don't develop this document just as staff creating an imagination of what we think the community wants. And in fact, a big driving principle in shaping how we start developing this budget has a lot to do with the strategic plan that we adopted back in October of 2020. And so as that driving principle helps us shape our annual budget is a strategic plan. This budget was prepared considering our adopted values, which include excellent customer service, integrity, accountability, and transparency. This budget has also been prepared using as guidance all 7 of our adopted multi-year goals and priorities. And for those that aren't familiar with what those goals and priorities are, the 7 goals include financial sustainability, which has been a major focus of our efforts over the last 4 budgets that I've been directly involved in, public safety, community and economic development, the reduction of homelessness, the investment in public infrastructure, communication and outreach has been a constant effort, along with organizational effectiveness and sustainability. I can tell you altogether, this budget respects the council's adopted values while accomplishing its adopted goals. The highlights for this 2023 fiscal budget, we've summarized in this particular chart, and of course, strong fiscal health carries through in how we've presented this budget for you. And we largely focus on 2 funds, now 2 funds with Measure P having been adopted. We actually use 2 funds now effectively to be the barometer of the city's health. And in addition to Measure P, we also look at the general fund. And in our effort to determine the fiscal health of the city, we actually look at cash flows affecting those particular funds. And you'll see later in the presentation an illustration of those cash flows. But we do cash flow forward for multiple years through 2030. And we can certainly tell you as we cash flow forward over the next 5 years, we're cash flowing positive in both of those models. We'll show you the exact numbers to illustrate how healthy we are. Other highlights of this budget include certainly the public safety enhancements, and that's been a big focus last year especially. But in this particular budget, the public safety enhancements you'll see are the addition of more ALPRs. Those are the automated license plate readers. We'll actually be entering phase 6 of that program, and you'll actually see the addition of 20 additional ALPR cameras to your traffic signals, which will take a total count to 127 cameras in our system. You'll actually see the delivery of 3 fire engines, medic engines, that will be placed into frontline service. Those are expected to be delivered in December-ish is our current time frame to receive those and place them into service. You'll also see right around this time next year, we're expecting a fire truck. It's actually a TDA or a tractor drawn aerial, also commonly referred to as a tiller. And it's actually a new unit that will actually push into front line ahead of our current frontline unit, which is medic truck 311. Will actually put that into reserve status and have a much newer, more operably efficient unit to help us attack incidents out in the field. And then you'll also see a water tender added to the complement of apparatus in our fire department. You will also see full stand-up. Our expectation is to stand up fully 315. And what that means is, of course, we were successful in this current fiscal year in opening 315, and we've opened it with a medic squad. That's a two-man paramedic unit. And we're effectively operating that way until we can have the reliability from one of the frontline engines come on board. And so between now and say December, our focus on the human resources side will be to complete the recruitment for the other complement of positions, the engineer and the captains that would outfit the actual medic engine. And so once that arrives and the staffing comes on board, our expectation currently is in January 2023 to be able to fully stand up Fire Station 315. On the community service and enhancement side, certainly there's highlights there. You'll see the completion of the wellness center as it's currently under construction. You've got library phase B, which is plan to relocate the existing library to the Green Tree Golf Course clubhouse environment. And interestingly, we have included for the community service enhancement side of the house, some plans to develop plans and do a streetscape and parking design in Old Town along 7th Street from Forest to D Street. And then, of course, the public infrastructure side, you can see it. We complain about it because it slows us down in our getting from here to there. But of course, you've got a number of public roadway improvements. We're wrapping up 7th Avenue and Arrowhead now. But you've, of course, got the Green Tree Bridge, which we're hoping is complete in June of 2023. Don't be surprised if that slips a little bit. But it looks like right now we're on track for that target. And then, of course, you've seen the construction going on at the Bear Valley Bridge. Major new capital improvement project is the long-awaited improvement to Bear Valley Road along the stretch of Amethyst to 395. So as we prepare this budget, especially as we do the cash flow modeling, we do have to make certain budget assumptions. And despite what you've seen as the council, especially as it relates to sales tax, we've enjoyed a couple of surprise years in terms of sales tax growth. And we're not spending that money frivolously. We're actually, and you'll see later in slides, using those unexpected sales tax revenues and actually cash flowing them to meet some of our funding goals. Excuse me, but in terms of sales tax being sustained, we're actually projecting a very conservative growth rate going forward. We actually are projecting a sustaining of development activity, which means we're actually budgeting same level as what we're experiencing this current fiscal year. For budgeting purposes, we're planning the same over the course of the upcoming fiscal year. We also have a number of rate planned enterprise organizations, starting with the Victorville Municipal Utility Services. And this budget that they've put together is anticipating a rate increase of 8%, which would become effective in August. And they are considering, based upon all of the costs of services that are being looked at regularly, they're actually considering another increase in January. With the approval of this budget, the only thing, presuming the council approves this budget as is, that would go in, we'd move towards immediately would be the 8%. To the extent staff believed at the utility that the additional 3.2 is necessary, we ultimately bring that back to the council. Your water system is actually operating, relying on an adopted 5-year rate plan. And that 5-year rate plan that this council, acting as the Water District Board of Directors, has already approved contemplates a 3% rate increase to the water system rates. Your sewer system also operates based upon a rate plan of 5 years. We're actually entering in this upcoming fiscal year, the final year of the 5-year rate plan. But in that particular case, there's two components. The one component that we directly deal with, which is the rate necessary to manage and maintain our collection system. And that rate, the collective rate is 10.88%. The city rate is 7.5%. And we are aware of, and we know of a rate increase required by VVWA, which is the treatment plant Joint Powers Authority. And they've adopted a rate that translates to 3.3%. And so that's expected as a part of the assumption going forward and necessary to keep the cash flow of that sewer system at its required levels. Similarly, in the case of solid waste, that's another one of your enterprises. It's also rate planned over a course of 5 years. This budget assumes the rate planned recommendation of a 3.2% increase, that as well as in year 5. And in both the sewer and solid waste case, we're expecting to start, if we haven't started already on that rate planning effort, if we can match up the time frame that we did 5 years ago, my vision would be to have rate plans back before this council for it to consider, probably in the February, not later than March timeframe. That way we have adequate time to review, approve, and then also get the requisite notices out so that we can actually meet the budget planning effort for this time next year. And then finally, since we had last met on user fees, we actually, now that we have an adopted user fee plan, we actually have those new user fees built into this budget. And we actually built them in for the 6 months that this council had agreed to start effectively the implementation January 1st. And that in and of itself amounts to about $1.5 million or $1.5 million of new revenue. That's an assumption that's actually built into this model as well. Organizationally, we're a big organization. This is what we look like. Of course, the council setting the policy, myself as the manager with the direct reports. And one of the things that we've done over the years is try to balance the organization because it's so big, and balance the organization in such a way where the departments and the divisions are manageable and not overwhelming. That's been a constant challenge for us as we're also constantly looking at ways to balance our workloads better. This organizational chart is only different from the one that we're currently operating from in that it recognizes the need to actually reestablish the community services department. For many, many years, we actually had a community services department that was last led by your deputy city manager, Ms. Janelle Davidson. She was actually the community services director before being appointed the deputy city manager. And as is proposed in this structure, the divisions that fall under community services would be parks, recreation, facilities, and library. And that would effectively, those divisions would report to a director before those divisions actually report then to the deputy city manager. So it gives an added level of supervision and oversight to those departments. A large part of those, some of those divisions report directly, one of those divisions reports directly to Ms. Davidson now in the library. But you also have parks that we actually placed in Public Works. Public Works actually did a really good job of managing and supervising that parks division. But I think there's a reality that we have realized in that it's a tremendous amount of workload for that division to oversee along with the other divisions that division currently sees. So altogether, it's going to help us manage those functions a little bit better, actually a lot better, I should say. The only other element that's different on here is realigning of, or the realigning of economic development from the Deputy City Manager Sophie Smith's side of the house. She is currently overseeing economic development, and this actual org chart looks to transition that responsibility and reporting directly to myself as a city manager, so that I can be more involved in some of the stuff that I really enjoyed doing when I first started here with the city. I certainly have some goals in mind, especially as it relates to Old Town, that I'd like to further along for this city. So this slide, first, I typically like to start out by identifying the number 82 in this particular case. Those are the total number of funds managed by your city. And why I put it there is so that I can put in context the collective responsibility of this city. It's fairly common for folks that don't understand all that a local municipality like ours, what our role and responsibility is. These 82 funds effectively I characterize as 82 business units with specific purposes. In fact, of these 82 funds, there's only 2 funds really that you have absolute discretion over, and you can do whatever you want with that money. And that effectively is your general fund and now Measure P. And even though we adopted Measure P on the premise that it's going to go towards public safety, we still use the reason why it was placed on the ballot as reasons for that fund. In fact, we have an oversight board in place that met last week, and I can tell you that the oversight board reviewed the planned expenditures that are in this document, and they've actually signed the letter supporting that what we've actually proposed for you is actually consistent with the intent of Measure P. But given the nature of the Measure P tax, it's a transactions and use tax. It's actually a general tax. And so those are the 2 funds that you have absolute discretion over. The rest of the funds have specific purposes, whether it's an enterprise fund or a special fund. A good special fund is, as an example, might be a Measure I, where you can specifically spend that money only on a specific purpose. And so that's, I bring that to mind because when you see a number such as what you see in this current fiscal year of $334.7 million on the revenue side and $320.7 million on the expenditure side, sounds like a tremendous amount of money, and it is a tremendous amount of money, but you just can't spend it on anything. And in fact, I think that's what a lot of the public comes to us, especially in the special asks that we get. We always try to help, but there certainly is limitations. And despite it being a $334 million budget on the revenue side, that money actually only goes so far. But to summarize this sheet for you, what this does illustrate is year to year from the current fiscal year of 21-22 to the upcoming year of 2023, your revenue side is projected to increase from $297.1 million to $334.7 million. That's a collective increase of about 12%. And then on the expenditure side, what you'll see is a $293.7 million increasing to $320.7. That delta is about a 9% increase on the expenditure side. But your net income, if you will, the revenue minus the expenditure is actually increasing to the order of $10.6 million. So positive growth there. The capital improvements, there are some carryover projects from the 21-22 fiscal year, but your capital improvements, which we'll summarize later in the presentation, are pegged at about $44.5 million. So this slide is to help the audience and ourselves get a better sense of what that money, how that money is generated, and how it's expended by classification. And so you'll see on the left side of the chart, speaking to the revenue projected of $334.7 million, you'll actually see it broken down in the 2 largest categories that you'll see there in the pie chart. is charges for service at 42%. And just to give you an example of what charges for services might be, your water district, for example, charges for service for each molecule of water consumed, say at your residence. There's actually a charge for that, and that's what would be an example of what goes into the charge for service. Same goes for sewer, trash, and even plan check fees, as an example, would be something lumped into that charges for service. In the next largest category, that's your taxes category, 30% is, which is the second largest there. The best examples of those, of course, are your sales tax and your property tax. And then on the expense side, you'll see operations and maintenance. Those are a variety of operations that go with the respective departments. But I think it's interesting to note and important to note that your biggest expense is not your personnel costs. It's certainly your second largest, but the personnel cost is a large contributing factor to being able to actually execute and providing all of those operations and maintenance items. And then, as I touched a little bit on the types of funds, this takes it one step further to characterize of those funds where you have discretion, where you have to operate as a small business, and where you have special restrictions. And so the largest of the funds, I'm sorry, backing up, of the types of funds that we are responsible for managing, there's 4 types of funds. You've got your general fund, you've got a special fund, you've got a fiduciary fund, and you've got your enterprise fund. I think the best way to characterize an enterprise fund is an operation of the city that operates very close to a business. I think the best example, if it's not the water district, the best example of an enterprise fund here in the city is the airport that you're responsible for overseeing in your capacity as the airport authority board of directors. But in the case of the airport operation of itself, it operates as an independent business. Though it's public, it generates its own revenues, it generates its own, it funds its own expenditures, and it manages its own cash. And what it does has to be spent for the purposes of that airport and to benefit the aeronautical system that it serves. General fund, of course, we touched on, is a discretionary fund. Measure P is called out separately because we are accounting for that separately. And then, of course, you've got your special revenue funds in there as well. So from that larger revenue and expenditure amount, we pull out the 2 funds that will start going over, the general fund and the Measure P. So from that larger amount, if we were to just look at the general fund, your total revenue generated in the general fund is $91.7 million. And that's going to be matching against an expenditure amount of $92.2 million, which actually shows a operating deficit to the order of $465,000. One thing about the general fund is that it is owed money from the Victorville Municipal Utility Services. And I believe we have payments due the general fund from VEMUS until 2026, but I could be corrected on that. But effectively with that loan repayment coming in, it actually makes your general fund operate to the good. Meaning it should, we're projecting that it operates this year at a surplus to the order of $535,000. This next slide is to help you get a sense of how that general fund is generated, the different types of revenue sources that comprise the general fund. And typically I like to have you look at the property tax and sales tax lines. And at the very end, you'll see a 22% and a 34%. And if you add those 2 together, and the number that I want you to remember for the next slide is 56%. 56% of your entire general fund, based on this slide, is generated from either property tax or sales tax. There's a number of other smaller revenue sources in there that comprise your general fund. And with that, one of the things that I did want to highlight for you is, and this slide does it fairly well, if you look at the sales tax line, and you actually start in the column summarized as 2020 actuals. And I mentioned earlier about some surprise and unexpected revenue generations. That's what I'm talking about in terms of the sales tax. So in 2020 and 2021, certainly received a large amount of money there, going from 21.775 million to 28.580. Certainly not expected. We're certainly not using that trend, even that same similarly natured trend going into 22. We're actually not using that trend to forecast this upcoming fiscal year. We're actually using a much more modest 3% number to get to the budgeted amount of 31.418 on the sales tax line. And so I asked you to remember the 56% from the previous slide. And the reason I do that is I like to compare those two largest sources of general fund money as, in this particular case, being just sufficient to cover your police and fire, which between those two public safety components is 55% of your total general fund expenditures. And I should note, particularly in one of the reasons why historically we've had this slide in here, and a large part of why we had considered a measure like Measure P, seeing that the point of this was seeing that public safety was consuming such a large share of then your only discretionary amount of money to pay for things like public safety. The issue that we were running into before was that the inflationary costs associated with police and fire were by far outpacing the growth. And so that was concerning to us a couple of years ago, not so much now, because certainly the Measure P has been able to give us some relief in being able to afford and expand your public safety services. And so this council recall, I believe it was last year, in fact, that we updated our general fund reserve policy. There was a point in time prior to last year that we had a reserve policy adopted at 15%, and that's a 15% measuring of available cash against next year's operating expenses. And we actually changed that because we wanted to actually put a method to the calculation in terms of it being an arbitrary number. But we actually studied our cash flows. We actually studied our operating expenses and made a determination as to, what is a necessary amount to help us weather the storm, if you will. And so the general fund reserve policy was put in place for fiscal responsibility purposes, but it was also put in place as effectively your rainy day fund. But now that's becoming the measure as to the health of your general fund and your Measure P funds as well. And so one of the things that you do here, and we actually cash flow forward as far as we can. In this particular case, we cash flowed for 8 years. We think it's most important to just focus over 5 years, because that's probably a reasonable management period where you need to look and be able to adjust if necessary. But you'll certainly see an expectation of your general fund revenues to continue to increase. You'll also see the same with your total expenditures on the expenditure line. But I think I'd like to start drawing your attention to both the 17% general fund reserve requirement, and that line particularly is identifying, if you wanted to meet your general fund reserve target of 17%, the number or the amount of money you need to have on hand is cash. And so in this particular slide, if you went to 22, 23 fiscal year column, it's saying that to meet your general fund reserve target, you need about $15.67 million. And what the line, the bolded line actually is calculating just right above that is the actual after cash flowing the revenues and expenses. You'll see a 33.78. Bottom line, what you're finding is that we're actually able to project in the general fund at fiscal year end a surplus of cash well above and beyond the general fund reserve. Saying it differently and maybe to make the math simpler, if your general fund reserve target is 17%, the very bottom line is telling you where your percentage is coming to. And so 17% versus what we're projecting in the 22-23 fiscal year, it's actually projected to end at a 37%. So the point in all that is that, and you can actually carry that forward as we cash flow, you'll actually see that as we project forward, certainly over the next 5 years, that actual reserve level increases. So we're actually improving our cash position on the general fund. What does that mean? Well, certainly it's good, but what it does mean is this council can take a position. One of the policy considerations it can make is to continue to enjoy being in a strong fiscal position. Quite honestly, when I look at a number like that, it gives me a perspective that if something dramatically happens, such as major meltdown in the economy, you've got an even longer period of time to be able to weather that storm. I think that's good, but also it does tell you that above your general fund reserve target, to the extent the council wanted to take on a special project or a new initiative, certainly there's within reason an ability to do that. This slide really is intended to just illustrate what I just said graphically, and I'm gonna have to play with my computer here. To illustrate it graphically, basically the blue bars is showing you the projected the cash at fiscal year end, and everything above the red line is effectively surplus to your general fund reserve target. So visually, you can see there's a good amount of cushion to operate from. Again, if there was an emergency or a special project the council wanted to consider. So transitioning into Measure P, and wanted to start this slide out by touching on the accomplishments. This fiscal year was our first full operating year relying on Measure P, and we made some major accomplishments that are all consistent with the intent of the measure and, of course, verified by the Oversight Board. I touched on the opening of Fire Station 315. We've also used Measure P funds to make upgrades at Fire Station 311. We added quite a bit of personnel to the police department, and I'm looking forward to the time where I can actually start bringing some stats back to you. It took a little bit of time once we approved the budget to actually hire the folks and get those folks on the police department side of the house actually in the field. But once we did, we're proud to announce that, and we were proud to announce that we were able to add 5 sworn deputies to the patrol. We were actually able to add 5 sheriff service specialists, which I've seen firsthand, helping improve our response time, especially to those lower priority calls, the 2s, 3s, and the 4s. And then we've also brought on board a crime analyst to help us much more quickly solve crimes and connect dots between the patrol deputies and, of course, the detectives working cases. We added 5 new code compliance officers. We made a number of facility upgrades to the recreation centers, made a number of ADA compliance improvements at the city parks. And then as far as the design for the library, that is underway at the Green Tree Golf Course, and that will serve as the city's new library. showing you the perspective similar to what we just did with the general fund. You'll actually see cash on hand of $19.4 million. That's how this budget is projecting to start the fiscal year. The projected revenue generated from Measure P is expected to be $29.5 million. And we're actually proposing to spend 31.3, which does speak to an operating deficit, but the availability of cash on hand will help you weather and balance that budget to meet the goals of the Measure P this year. I think it's important to note that, and you saw it this mid-year budget adjustment where we actually adjusted the mid-year Measure P revenue numbers to 26.35 million. Just to illustrate, similar to what we saw on the general fund side where we saw unexpected revenue growth, when we updated our budget at the mid-year to the $26.3 million number, that was actually an increase from $18.9 million. And of course, I'll share with you as well, because you probably already remember, and maybe this is for benefit of the audience, when we first started Measure P and when we came out of the gate, we were actually projecting $15.5 million. So we've seen tremendous amount of unexpected growth on that. We actually believe to some degree this will sustain. We certainly have no reason to believe that it'll drop down to our original projection amounts. There's a lot of reasons for that that I can go into offline. But we believe this Measure P and the unexpected revenue growth will actually help us achieve a lot more of our public safety goals. So some of those highlights that we're actually proposing as expenditure in the Measure P, we did mention a water tender, and really what a water tender is a water truck that really helps keep the supply of water going for your responding engines to, say, remote areas. And we most commonly have a need for a water tender down in our river bottom, especially when there is a fire. And given the absence of access to things like fire hydrants, water tender becomes a very important piece of apparatus that basically serves as a rotating supply line of water to keep those engines full and pumping water on those fires. So that's something we've had a dependency on allied fire supporters to provide that apparatus. This will give us a little bit more control over our apparatus and being able to deploy it when we need it. The additional code and animal control officers will continue the proactive approach by improving community and commercial appeal, investigate environmental complaints, reduce community blight, continue to provide code compliance service 7 days a week. And that's an enhancement in the service that we're actually proposing in this budget. And also to increase our attention to those that are experiencing homelessness out in the field. We've touched on the library. That is focus. We're also looking at adding or investing in and then adding to the library vending machines and intelligent lockers. We're also depending on or relying on Measure P to help fund our match. That may explain, if you look through the book, one of the big changes you saw on the community improvements line item, the matching funds necessary to actually finish the construction of the wellness center, along with help supplement the operations. And finally, and I have to say this because unless you've seen one of these, you kind of scratch your head about what it is. But we're actually planning to fund 2 self-cleaning restrooms, one that'll be sited at Center Street Park in Victorville and at the Transit Center downtown. And this is a unit that will actually, literally, it says it in its name. These are going to be public restrooms installed that have self-cleaning mechanisms built into them to help keep them sanitary, but also have to reduce the amount of maintenance and attention that we as staff have to give to a number of our other facilities. And so just as we did with the general fund, we actually cash flow forward. And while this goes out 8 years, 5 years is typically where we're at our comfort zone. And effectively what this cash flow does show is similar to the general fund, a buildup of cash, certainly in excess of a 17% Measure P reserve. While we adopted last year the 17% reserve policy, we will be bringing back for the council that same policy to be extended to Measure P, just to also have the same type of safety net in place to help keep Measure P running and so that it has its own rainy day fund in case we experienced an issue. But altogether, all of this budget and the changes that you're seeing or the recommendations you're seeing later in the presentation actually show even the Measure P fund as being healthy on the go forward. This year, when we set the stage to start the budget process and considering where we've been over the years, considering the workload that we're all attending to, considering the evolution of positions to where certain positions and roles of positions have expanded to much more responsible duties. We asked all the departments to take a hard look at their departments, at their people, and make a couple of decisions. Are employees properly classified? Are they still working in the same classification? Maybe because of experience and because of responsibility the city has taken on, they're actually doing more. And also start thinking about how we can start increasing our bandwidth as people. And to the extent we can bring additional positions on to help those bandwidth issues that we're experiencing currently with the workforce, but also to start thinking about succession planning. I tasked all the departments to think about those issues as they prepared this budget. And this budget altogether on the net proposes a personnel increase of 468 employees, which is our current approved position level, to a position level of 516 employees. This slide is intended to show the breakdown of where those net position adds take place. And you'll actually see the largest of the position adds are occurring in the Public Works Water Department. They've got a net positive of 19 positions. The next largest increase is on your code compliance side at 8 positive. And then of course, you've got 4 positive for both fire and human resources. And one of the things that we did do is on the dais, we also gave a much deeper breakdown of what that chart is summarizing, because in addition to the position adds and the position deletes, there are also a number of position upgrades as well. And the attachment that's on the dais goes into a deeper dive, basically shares with you the numbers that are behind and supporting the net effect of this chart. This slide is here to help you get a sense of the trajectory of our position count over the years. Also to help encourage you to not be scared by that dramatic of a change year over year in the position adds, because 516 certainly sounds a lot more than where we're currently at. But we're still fairly lean. And if we were to try to use a measurable, and the measurable that we use is just the trend over the last 20 years, what you'll see in this slide is we're certainly not at peak level in terms of employee count, and you'll actually see peak level in 2007, 2008, at a time when we did have in-house city fire, as we again do now. And I think it's safe to say that with the employee count proposed in this upcoming budget of 516, and you compare that to the altogether population increase, which is almost a little over 27,000 population more, and then the increase in the diversity of responsibility. Certainly in 2007, 2008, we didn't take on a subject like homelessness, which in today it's a very large focus of one of the many things that we're doing. Our roles have expanded in terms of service level to our communities. And of course, the employee count. We're still lean is the point that I think is appropriate to make in seeing this slide, even at proposing the 516 employee count. So in addition to asking all of the executives and the leadership to take a close look at the workload and balancing the workload and establishing succession planning where necessary. You're also aware that we had undertaken similar to what we did when we were working with labor and effectively finalizing their MOU. Shortly after starting the labor study for the represented class, we then began a study for the non-represented class. And with that, we finally were able to complete that study on May 17th, 2020. And what that study was doing is it took a benchmark of about 63 positions. And from those 63 positions, the consultants we worked with were really focused on determining competitiveness. How do we fare in terms of being competitive as a city for labor? And interestingly, what it did share with us is that altogether, we're fairly competitively priced. 76% of our benchmark positions were actually identified as competitively priced. Largely from the positions of manager and above is where we were starting to fall short. But in this particular study, it was broad in that it studied 12 different municipalities. The cities that we studied included Apple Valley, Chino, Corona, Fontana, Hesperia, Ontario, Palmdale, Rancho Cucamonga, Riverside, and Upland, just to name a few of those. And so with that, we used the results of those studies to actually start crafting where we're headed in terms of making recommendations towards compensation. And so first, as we did that, we actually, the table of org that you're used to seeing, and it'll be coming back ultimately for the council to consider, I believe, next Tuesday as a companion to the budget. We actually had to take a close look at our table, and the table of compensation actually will be updated. And that's just to correct some alignment issues. And so we ran into some alignment issues that were created effectively a few years ago when we eliminated the furlough and passed the furlough benefit to the employees, but we did not pass that furlough value in terms of 10% increase in salary to department head level positions. It actually created an alignment issue, and so we'll actually correct that. So our traditional ranges are going to change for level 57 and above. But in those areas where we ran into some competitiveness issues, we'll actually reclassify the managers that are currently classified at range 50 to range 52. In that particular case, and in these reclassifications on ranges, they won't be immediate salary increases for those employees, but what it will do, because the study that we did do actually compared our top end salary against other agencies' top end salary. And so that's where we're losing the competitiveness. And so effectively in these positions where we're actually changing classifications and ranges, just ranges, that's actually to give them more earning ability over time, over the course of continued years of service. So in that particular case of the managers, it won't be an immediate increase to salary. In the case of the directors, they're going to be reclassified largely from 64 to 66. The deputy city managers are calling for a reclassification to 73. There's one particular position where we have to, in our recommendation includes it, where we have to act because we were so not competitive. And that's in the area of the battalion chief. And so one of the things that this budget proposes is making an immediate salary adjustment to the battalion chiefs, and that would be increasing their current levels about 7.74%. That combined with a recommendation that's forthcoming here actually brings them, in our opinion, as staff, much more competitive. It also eliminates an issue that was created when we negotiated our MOU with labor. And we actually brought the captains up because of the results of those studies, created a crowding issue on the table of org. But beyond the crowding issue, that wasn't the only motivation to move these battalion chiefs up. It has a large part to do with the value to this organization, but also the lack of competitiveness we found ourselves in when comparing ourselves to other agencies. Other recommendations by myself in this presentation to you. We still have quite a few employees that still have not put to use the COVID paid time off, and it's not because they don't want to. In large part, it has more to do with the fact that, again, the workload of our employees is huge. And quite honestly, it's difficult when the workload is that huge and you've got such a high level of high number of dedicated employees. People are not inclined to take the time off that's available to them. And so to help remedy that and provide them more time, especially believing that position additions, helping with the bandwidth issues comes online in this upcoming budget year. We're actually proposing to extend the COVID PTO to June 30th, 2023. So that would give them more time to use that leave. We've identified a number of benefits based upon feedback from employees of things that really don't cost us anything as a city, but seem to be important in value to the employees. And that's having access to, say, a 529 college savings plan, legal aid program, also a pet insurance program. And with the pet insurance program, I will just for fun, maybe to bring a little humor to this, we did receive one question regarding the pet insurance program. And even though if I were to be characterized as a dog, say by my wife, that doesn't necessarily make me eligible for the pet insurance program, and I couldn't give up my health insurance. So for the person that asked that question, no, you can't characterize yourself as a pet to take advantage of this insurance program. So with that, we also have a program that we're actually proud to be in a position to recommend, and that's proposing an enhanced parental leave program. And effectively for those employees, female employees particularly, that are in our labor force that do get pregnant and do deliver a child, they are afforded FMLA protection, which basically is job protection, to the extent that person can get approval by their clinician to actually not come back to work and be on a short-term disability. Certainly short-term disability is available to those employees as well. But one of the things that we're going to do to ease the stress, if you will, especially during such an important time, is for all employees, male and female, for male and female employees that they be afforded 4 weeks of pay, 60% of their pay, above and beyond what's already afforded under FMLA or short-term disability. And this would be also available for not just full-time employees. This would be available to part-time employees as well. And it would be extended not just for natural birth, but also for cases of adoption. And so this is one of those things that we believe is hugely important to our workforce. And so we're actually pleased to be recommending this. And this was also based upon feedback we received from some of our employees. Shoe allowance, that's always a big issue, and we're going to increase that amount, especially for those that have need for safety shoes. And it actually provides some flexibility that they can buy more than one pair because it's very common that there is a need for more than one pair. And then finally, and the big one that seems to be what's really on everybody's mind throughout the city is what's the COLA going to be? And as you know, we measure COLA from March to March. And the COLA that we measure is for the MSA of Ontario, Riverside, and San Bernardino. And this year's cost of living was calculated at 10%. And we worked really hard to try to figure out, and one of our focuses in this budget was trying to do everything we can to help mitigate the effects that we're all experiencing, whether it's the cost of gas or the cost of food. And so effectively, these models, all the numbers that we ran in front of you, actually do contain a COLA for all employees, part-time and full-time, at a COLA rate of 10%. And so that's our recommendations as to the personnel. This slide was intended just to put in context that recommendation of 10%. And while you will find that it's the largest recommended over the last 20 some odd years, this does give you a good history of where we've been with COLA. We have tried to match it where we can. Not every year is apples to apples comparison as to what we're recommending before you tonight, because a number of years considered COLA, but they also considered packages coincident to COLA. But certainly the largest, but certainly supported based upon the actual CPI for all consumer users in those aforementioned MSAs. Now we're going to touch on to, and we're going to get back into some numbers. We're going to get into the enterprise and special funds. And so starting out with water, and I'll be touching on some of the capital improvements as well, but we touched on water before or earlier in the presentation. We also talked about an assumption of a rate increase of 3%. This gives you a good summary of both Water District 1 and Water District 2 combined to generate revenues in the order of $57.5 million. That balances against a $54.6 million expense number, and you're actually seeing a surplus, which will actually go into one of its reserve accounts to basically be available for operations or capital in the future of the rate plan. This particular budget includes almost $8 million in capital improvement projects, and effectively those capital improvements, there's about 1.14. Actually, they're largely all for small diameter pipelines affecting both Area 1, Area 2, and Area 5 of the Water District. There's also a small fiber optic extension program being proposed in this budget. Water is also recommending and we're proposing crane truck replacement along with a small dump truck. Those would be the equipment items that are actually baked into their budget here. On the sewer side of the house, and this is largely dealing with our collection system and then paying the pass-through rates to VVWA for the treatment. But effectively your sewer fund 425, has a revenue projected of $23.316 million. This actually assumes that 10.88 rate increase over the revenue side of the house. That's actually balanced against 24.746 million, which shows a dependency of 1.429 of cash available. And the way the rate plans work is the rate plans work in such a way where they intentionally fund reserves to be able to weather high spend years such as this one. Major projects that you'll see in this budget, you'll actually see an Old Town septic to sewer conversion of almost $600,000. You'll actually see phase 2 of a large sewer main lining project. And that's to help improve the integrity of their collection system in the order of about $2 million. There's another $200,000 in the capital improvement budget there to actually relocate a water main in the Santa Fe Wash. Solid waste touched on as another rate funded. You'll see almost $23 million on the revenue side, matched against 23.2 on the expenditure side. It also deficit spends, but the reason why we put the available resources there is really to show you that similar to the sewer case, as we previously mentioned, your rate plan actually plans for spendy years like this. And so you actually balance your solid waste budget relying on cash available. Your next one is your street lighting fund. That's Fund 2.0. This fund did experience a 10% increase in the current fiscal year. We're actually proposing another increase in the upcoming fiscal year that actually increases that rate to $16.92 per EDU per year, which is a $1.54 increase. And so with that, you'll see 2.5 almost on the revenue side against 3.2 on the expense side. It is a capital spending year. And so the capital that you'll actually see and projects that you'll actually see from this budget first starts with streetlights on 7th Street from the stretch of Forest to D Street. We'll also have an update coming up shortly as the council asked for. But that is one item that is in this budget. And the scope of that work effectively is going to be replacing the decorative lighting that exists in Old Town and replacing it with your more standard Cobra head. And despite the nostalgia that you might find with those decorative lights, they don't illuminate very well. And so we were able to determine the best way to bring greater illumination to that stretch of roadway is to bring in the LED Cobra heads. And so that'll actually be, that's planned for in this upcoming budget. You also have the traffic signal at Condor and Mojave that is funded in large part from the street lighting fund, but you also have another traffic signal that's coming out of this budget for traffic signal at Tawny Ridge and Village Drive. Storm drain fund. No real change here. You're actually operating at a slight surplus revenue over expenditure. In the case of the Southern California Logistics Airport, and if you were to just drop down to the bottom and saw the available resources, this is a number, the 4.896 number, that's basically reflecting the cash that's available. And this is speaking to the on-airport operations. That number has increased well over the last few years. We're actually very proud of its improved cash position on the airport operations side. But you'll see, again, in this particular case, you'll actually see revenues of almost $12 million outpacing the total expenditures of 11.5. And to give you an example, the revenues generated are largely going to be your lease revenues, your aircraft parking revenues. Examples of expenditures are air traffic control expenses, people expenses, maintenance of airfield expenses, along with facility expenses. Your major capital improvements under this budget, got a couple of large roof replacement projects. One is building 682, the other is building 685, and it's time to upgrade, make some upgrades to the existing security system that secures the airfield. Municipal utility budget, you've got $23.5 million being generated, and that's over both the electric and natural gas operations. For the benefit of the public that isn't aware, we do have an electric utility and a natural gas utility operating at SCLA and providing services to commercial and industrial customers. The electric system for VMIS also provides electrical service to customers out in Foxborough. Those are the only two areas where services are provided, and they're largely provided to provide a much more competitively priced utility. And so in the case, despite the proposed 8% increase in this upcoming rate plan, we're still projecting on the electric side to be well under Edison to the order of 10% less than their current tariff rate structure. Your major CIP projects on the gas side, there's a large natural gas replacement pipeline project, and we should also finally see the interconnect completed, which will increase the capacity of electric services for customers that are growing out at SCLA. And then finally, as we near the end of this presentation, to touch on a variety of the capital improvement projects that are baked into the budget on the park side of the house. And I'm only going to touch on the ones that I haven't touched on so far. On the park side of the house, you'll actually see money being invested in the resurfacing of your parking lots at a variety of the parks throughout the city. You'll see landscaping at the activity center. We'll actually begin the feasibility study for a sports complex. And then you also have a variety of park improvements that will enhance some of the features at our parks throughout our park system. On the facilities and on the facility side of the house, as I already touched on police as well. On the facility side, we're actually focused in this upcoming budget to actually consider some security upgrades, improvement of security here to the facilities at City Hall. You're probably familiar with the layout here, but it's a very open design, and it was actually designed intentionally for that. But certainly as we've been dealing with just the concerns altogether of the public, you see a lot of unfortunate events occurring. We're at a point where it's time to reconsider and reevaluate our layout and trying to provide a little bit more protection and security to our employees here, especially at times of unrest amongst people. So that will be an improvement in the upcoming budget. And we touched on the self-cleaning restrooms. Streets are big for us. And of course, we're going to continue ahead with the Braintree extension. I've got a chance to go out and see some of the progress of that project, and it's moving along quite nicely. There's an extensive amount of work going on right now in cutting down a large hill that will eventually become a roadway transitioning into Ridgecrest. But we're expecting that project. There's definitely more to spend on that project, and we're hoping that it's completed at the end of this fiscal year. We've got a number of guardrail replacement projects being proposed. You've got some tract improvements, interestingly, from a settlement we received. There's some tract improvements that were not put in by a developer will actually help complete those improvements being constructed to a residential tract. Bear Valley Road, Amethyst 395, we touched on. And then finally, the ones that I haven't touched on here, we are proposing in this upcoming budget to help enhance our sweeper operations, a new sweeper and a new shaker to make our operations a little bit more functional. We do include in this budget $3.2 million to actually get the construction drawings and possibly start with the construction work to actually outfit what was the restaurant area to be a new library area. Some of the major equipment you'll find outlined, major equipment purchases. You'll actually see backhoes for gas. There's a need to get a new traffic long line striper to help our street lighting operations. We've got a number of truck replacements on the code side. Water's got some equipment. We've talked about fire, and then there's also line item in there to bring on some undercover vehicles to supplement the police effort out in the field. Finally, just looking forward to give you a perspective of what we are envisioning occurring. So speaking to projects entitled, which means they've gone through the planning process or that are under construction. We've seen a lot going on out at SCLA. And so at SCLA, you've got the Amazon Fulfillment Center, which is about a 1.3 million square foot building that's vertical and completing construction. Iron Mountain is a large 461,000 square foot warehouse. And then you also have about another 900,000 or so of warehousing space nearing completion for Mars Pet Care and Church and Dwight. Got some shopping center got a shopping center being proposed at Amethyst Crossings. It's about 98,000 square feet of multi-tenant shopping space. Right there at Bear Valley and Amethyst. Got a new restaurant in Locust. And then, of course, to this budget, but our vision currently is to present this budget to the council on June 21st at the regular city council meeting with a recommendation for approval. So with that, I'll yield back to you, Madam Mayor.
All right, thank you, Mr. Metzler. All right, with that said, Madam Clerk, the recommendation, please.
No action is required at this time. It is recommended that the city council discuss and provide direction to staff regarding the proposed fiscal year 2022-2023 budget. A public hearing has been set for June 21st, 2022 to consider adopting the proposed budget.
All right, thank you, Madam Clerk. All right, now we're going to move on to questions and comments based on the staff report and the presentation. As we're going to have no motion this evening, we're going to combine the two. And as I said earlier, we're going to allow for 5 minutes per council member. We're going to begin this evening with Mayor Pro Tem Irving.
Good evening. How are you? First of all, I want to thank staff for putting together a budget and all the hard work and effort that went into preparing this document. Certainly, we all know that a budget is a roadmap to the future. And so for the most part, I'm very, very pleased with the proposed recommendations. It sounds like our city is fiscally healthy. And I just wanted to say, I'm glad that we are investing in personnel. We've lost some key members or key staff members. And so with making those changes and recommendations, I think they came from the city manager. I'm very happy to see that. The only questions that I do have, I have a wish list, of course, some things that I would like to see happen that I did not see in the highlights of the presentation. For an example, let me ask a question. With the park improvements, does that include lighting at some of the parks? I know you spoke about resurfacing and so forth.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and City Council. This year's budget does not include any additional funding for improving the lighting at the parks because we do have a bit of a backlog currently with our project workload. We have a number of lights that just need to be installed at parks, and then we'll resume adding a couple new parks in the following fiscal year.
Okay, so we should see it perhaps within the next 2 years?
You'll continue to see the lighting increase at the parks, but there is no new funding in this proposed budget.
Okay, very good. Also, as it relates to public safety, I did not see a line, I did not see in the highlights any, and this may not even fall under our, this may not be something that we deal with. Body cams, that will be the San Bernardino County Sheriff, right? Because we didn't talk about that. And I think a lot of citizens are anxiously awaiting the beginning of that program. We've had elections, and so I'm hoping we see something by Christmas.
The body cameras, you're correct, Mayor Pro Tem Irving, in that's not in our budget, but we actually did budget monies expecting that the camera program that's led and implemented by the Sheriff's Department, we did budget as if we would see them for the last 6 months of the fiscal year. And that's all dependent upon how quickly the Sheriff's Office can deploy that system countywide. I know they're focused on that right now, but that's our current goal is we do have funding in this budget to be able to pay for that cost. And the hope is that the sheriff is actually in a position to be able to have that fully implemented, say by January 1st.
Okay. Along that train of thought, the other thing that I just want to just put it out there because you spoke about where we get our revenues and expenditures and so forth. And not so much with County Sheriff's Department, but with the Fire Department. Is there, at least in the future, an effort to increase representation for additional women and BIPOC in our department? I know we have one person of a male of color. Well, we might see some increase in recruitment in that area, because fire departments across the nation, they've had problems in that area. That is something that I would like to see happen.
Thank you for that. And certainly we were very welcoming of those audiences to be a part of our fire service. We, of course, have to go through a competitive process first, but we're very open to and excited about trying to improve the diversity in the department.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, I noted that we have in our future, we're going to do some streetscaping on 7th between Forest and D, and I'm very excited about that. Because I'll be honest, I travel that way often to work, and there was an area of concern in terms of like maintenance and curb appeal along that short stretch. So I'm very happy to know that we're going to be doing some streetscaping and also improving the lighting in the area. With that, overall, I'm very satisfied. I'm not going to try and get into the weeds of the budget because that's not my area of expertise. But conceptually in terms of the big picture. Those were my concerns and comments. And so I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. All right, Member Gomez.
Yes, on 6/13/2022, around afternoon, I sent an email to over 20 employees and it included departments to address my questions in writing, as it continues to be my request to be produced as soon as possible. I also have a couple of recommendations. I'd ask that the city increases reserves to at least 20%, to have police report accountability at least quarterly, besides the budget amendments that we have seen, to look at parks and recs as an extension of public works to be able to receive those jackets, those shoes, treating our part-time employees by respecting their seniority and bringing them to positions where they can eventually progress into the hierarchy of the ladder that we have in the city, instead of having them revert to mediation boards to mitigate equity, as we did when we merged public works and community services. In my letter that I sent on June 12th, it said, after looking through the agenda per department, I noted that the figures and data have absolutely no context to interpret the data based on staff experience and understanding for what the data reveals. Unfortunately, this type of approach is not a comprehensive one and requires extensive briefing and writing for any community member to feel included in the civic aspect of its procured investments. And you guys do have a lengthy set of questions that, again, I'm requesting that if you can provide that as soon as possible. I have other questions that I delineated just for the sake of being able to participate and have members of the audience also understand what is going on inside the representation of several of my council colleagues, as well as other members that may not be present. One of my questions is, how often are council members on the ground overseeing the VMAs hands-on that would lead to a decision to be able to adopt a potential 3.2% increase?
So, Member Gomez, you've asked
Questions and no, I didn't.
I know.
That's my only question that I answered. I mean, I asked right now.
Okay, because there was a flurry of them and I didn't know
Yeah, they were all comments and this was,
one of them at a time. but this
yes,
is a question for sure.
this one is a question for sure.
If I understood the question correctly, I think you were asking how many of the council members have actually been close enough to the electric utility to be able to recommend an increase. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so if that question is correct, I would suspect the answer is because the role of the city council isn't to oversee the actual operations. That's the role of the city manager. So effectively, that's my role and responsibility to carry that recommendation forward. So I wouldn't expect any of the council members, though they're certainly welcome to go out and touch it and see it. I wouldn't expect any of them to get hands-on enough to be able to recommend the rate increase.
And can the city mitigate the 3.3 by doing a pilot program where water replenishing and recycled water partnerships are created to diminish costs associated with what I believe we have adjudicated water?
Well, now I think you're bobbing and weaving between different utilities. First, you were talking to the electric utility, and that rate increase is, if I remember correctly, closer to 8%. The 3.2 is water. Those are completely separate utilities, completely separate enterprises.
Yes, that's so based on our presentation, I have several questions that are going to jump all over the board and I only have 5 minutes. So the next question was pertinent to water recycling and replenishment. I didn't bridge that gap for you because I only have 5 minutes to ask. And every time I try to contextualize it for you, I'm already losing time.
Okay, so now that we're clearly focused on water, can you restate your question?
Absolutely. So there was in the presentation a 3.3 increase. And I thought to myself, well, are we looking at other avenues such as the cost of water, of recycling, or creating some kind of partnership with other members so that that increase doesn't have a high impact?
Yes, the answer is yes. We're looking at a number of alternatives to make sure that our production costs are low. We're also expanding our efforts to encourage conservation.
Okay, and then I saw that we had 82 funds. Historically, I've known that we've exceeded 82. Did we consolidate some of these funds?
No, I remember having increased over time, maybe from 81. So we've actually added a fund or two. And that happens, especially when we receive, say, a grant that may not have a fund specifically attached to it. I think ARPA was probably the latest example where we actually had to create a separate fund for it just so that we can isolate its accounting.
And page 10's pie chart, where does the golf course expenses come from?
Well, golf course is part of our Parks and Recreation system, so it would actually be funded from our parks budget. You said page 10?
Yeah, that was a pie chart.
That likely would come from the actual cost would likely come from the general fund.
Thank you. And we had a reserve. How long would that reserve keep us at a 17% if we had some cause, a natural cause?
On the general fund, the cash flow model that we showed and actually stopped tracking actually goes out to the end of the 2030 fiscal year.
So over 6 months.
Yes.
Thank you. And we have a surplus. How do we have a surplus when there's a looming debt of $1 million?
A looming debt of
Yes.
$1 million.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
What do I mean? I was looking at the 2022, 2023, and I saw a debt which was not a surplus. So you try to mitigate with your wording that we're doing good because at this time there's somehow cash on hand. But I didn't really see that the cash on hand would cover that when we have all these other deficits that were depicted, but you worded them really crafty. So I just want to make sure that I understood that 1 million that I see, you
The-
don't see.
The 1 million that you're speaking to is actually effectively a revenue into the general fund. That's another fund paying the general fund back. So that's not a looming debt of the general fund. That's actually revenue, for lack of a better term, coming into the general fund to help offset the net income, which on slide 11, my slide 11, actually without that shows a net income of a negative 465,000. But with that loan repayment coming in, it actually gives you a surplus of 534,000.
So anything on brackets is considered a deficit, and this was not within nothing other but deficit brackets. Did I misread that?
Restate your question, please.
Yes. There's parentheses in the word deficit and parentheses on the $1 million. Is that not to be translated as a deficit?
I don't see parentheses on my $1 million in page 11. What page are you on?
I didn't delineate that page, but I will definitely send you an email with what I'm looking at.
Okay.
And then do all 23 parks have restrooms with no exceptions?
I don't know the answer to that. Janelle, are you aware?
We do have a few parks that do not have restrooms, but the proposed budget includes adding restrooms at Eagle Ranch and Brentwood.
Okay, and my next question is for the recreation and library. Those were at one point community service employees. When we parse or bifurcate these, how do we know how many employees were in one sector versus the other before we brought them all together and merged them as one?
I don't have those numbers handy, but I think the characterization is not exactly correct. They're city employees first. They're actually still in their respective divisions. So the Parks Division is still the Park Division. It just happens to currently report to the Public Works Department. And the same goes with facilities, for example. Facilities is a division. It's still intact the way it was when it was under a community services department, but when we chose not to reestablish the department, that division actually reported to the building department. So effectively, the recreation of the community services department would take those same divisions and basically put them back unaltered in reporting to a new community services director.
Okay, and were you able to start on answering some of those questions for the various questions that I had?
No, I have not. I've been focused since you sent that on putting this presentation together along with the budget.
Can I expect to have something in writing?
Okay, we're gonna pause here. Just
Well, because I don't want to keep asking the questions because he's going to
Uh,
definitely fill
I,
them out.
I appreciate that. So if you could pause for just a moment. So, because the questions were done outside of the typical agenda review, to the extent, Mr. Metzler, that those questions aren't already covered in the budget presentation and the staff report, feel free to answer those as soon as you can. And then the rest of the council should also have access to those questions and answers.
And I can certainly share them with you. And when I did take a glance at them, when I did receive them yesterday, I did see that certainly this workshop was the more appropriate forum to discuss these items. That's in part why I didn't want to feel like I was duplicating efforts. So I actually think now is the best time, because to the extent there's a question that could lead into policy decision of this council, now is probably the best time to have that conversation, as opposed to waiting for me to be able to sit down and navigate through all of these questions.
Well, that's a fair statement. So, Madam Clerk, how much time does Member Gomez have left for questions and comments?
32 seconds.
Okay, so how long do you think, how many questions did you submit, Member Gomez?
So I submitted enough questions to trigger a response where he's going to be able to allow me to understand. So I'll just wait for that, and I'm not going to ask any further questions because I'll be expecting something in writing. Thank you.
Okay, based on, okay, gotcha. Mr. Messer, you understand the criteria for doing that, right?
I do.
Okay, all right, perfect. All right, thank you, Member Gomez. And now we're going to move on to Member Becerra.
Thank you. Mr. Metzler, I have some questions through the presentation you just gave us. On page 7, I noticed that the planning department now is going to have the homelessness solution. Does that also include the wellness center? I noticed their budget went up just a little bit.
Page, I'm sorry.
7 on your slideshow.
The org chart.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you restate the question? I was struggling.
I noticed that the planning department has homelessness solution under it. Does that also include the wellness center? Because I noticed the budget went up.
I'm sorry. Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
Sad to see parks going, but I notice on here, parks is also under public works, and this is titled changes to the table of work. Some maintenance workers were added. Are those to upgrade our maintenance workers, maintenance aides in the Parks Department?
If I can, probably the best one to speak to that specific would be Ms. Davidson. Would you help me with that?
Yes, the budget proposes to upgrade 5 maintenance aides to full-time maintenance workers in the Parks Division.
And the maintenance aides have always been offered the same boot program, the same jacket program, T-shirts, things like that.
When it was moved under Public Works, my understanding is that they were all ordered jackets and they have all received the same safety shoe allowance.
Okay. I also noticed, whether Ms. Davidson or yourself, Mr. Metzler, 2 positions being added. They're listed under Environmental Program Compliance Inspector and Environmental Program Specialist. Are those 2 for the new state mandate for the 3rd trash can?
Yes, that's correct.
And the state is sending us a check to cover those 2 positions, right?
Oh, no.
So that's what I kind of figured under that. Mr. Metzler, what I didn't see for our new police department that we're trying for, do we have anything under there that we can at least start the work?
There is, yes, and I'm sorry I missed that point, because that's a very important point. We do have money in the budget to bring on a designer to help us with 2 scopes. The first scope is going to be a concept scope to look at 2 locations that we've discussed in the past, but also to come up with a concept based upon interviews, mainly of the PD, of what their facility needs are. And from those concepts, then once we can come to terms as to what the concept is we want to build. The next phase of that, and there's money in the budget to actually kick that effort off would be to actually then go to design, the design of the facility. Construction, I wouldn't expect in this, well, I certainly wouldn't expect it in this budget. If we can get through those two phases, it's possible that we can envision construction amounts being included in next year's budget.
Okay. And then Measure P, we've also been able to open all fire stations that we've have built.
That's correct.
And do we have any fire stations west of 395?
No.
Are we looking at putting, I know in the past, the builder building a track has been responsible for giving us land. Is there any land available to us to build a fire station on the other side of 395?
There may be, but I think one of the things that we've got to determine first as a fire department is not only where do we want to grow, but how do we want to grow, both in terms of service type. And we want to make sure that as we do grow, if in fact growth includes the addition of stations, that we're doing it when it's actually necessary.
Okay. Page 16, it says of your thing, parks improvement, ADA compliance at city parks. We're talking the jungle gyms, the sidewalks, things like that. So the ADA compliant of playing, the kids can also play, correct?
Correct. And maybe Ms. Davidson, is there something that you can elaborate on?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear all of that question. Would you mind repeating?
Which says we have park improvements and ADA compliance at city parks. I know that was the restrooms, the self-cleaning restrooms, but also some of the playground equipment has been upgraded under ADA compliance and sidewalks leading to the playground equipment, correct?
We have done some playground upgrades and we do try to incorporate some inclusive features. Perhaps that's what you're thinking of there. But that wasn't Measure P. Measure P did assist with helping with some, I'm sorry, path of travel improvements and that sort of thing, but not playgrounds.
Is continuing upgrading our parks in this year's budget. I noticed all the bathrooms in Brentwood and Eagle Ranch, things like that.
Yes.
Also our playground equipment.
Playground equipment is actually covered under our Prop 68 grants that we're working through.
Okay. You also mentioned a hydrogen production plant. Is it just going to be production or also fill?
The site plan that they're currently working from actually contemplates 2 fill stations.
Okay. You also said comments, correct?
Yes.
I'd like to thank you and your staff, your management staff, well put together. You guys have brought us to a point that the city has never seen. In all my years dealing with the city, I've never seen us in such a outgoing and positive, fun. So thank you very much to staff. Thank you very much to the employees that make it happen on a day-to-day basis out there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Member Becerra. All right. Let's see. I'm going to try to do this quickly. I remember the days, Mr. Metzler, before I was on the council and then within the first year or so being on the council when we weren't anywhere near a 15% reserve. So the fact that we hit 17 and we're more than double that, it's quite astonishing, and kudos to you and your entire team. With regard to the Measure P funds. So initially when this was moved forward by the council, the goal was 30 police personnel. And we're at 11 now. And so we're still looking at hitting that goal of 19. And I know that that's, going to be a little bit of time because just to be clear, that is because we need to build a new a new police station. That wasn't fully anticipated at the time of that public safety plan.
That's correct.
Okay. And again, just to confirm, the Measure P Oversight Committee has approved what's projected in this budget in terms of expenditures.
They did. In fact, we met with them last Thursday, I believe it was, presented to them, and they did very minor deviations in the numbers. For example, we had some updated work comp numbers and insurance-related costs. But the concept of what's here before you has been approved and signed off by the Oversight Board Committee.
Okay, and when we did the analysis comparing salaries in nearby cities and so forth of employees, it was done on May 17th. Do we know if any of those had recently upgraded their pay scales, or is that everyone just does that during the budget time? So we're all on an even keel when doing that analysis?
That's a good assessment, and that is the one thing that's really not known because the commencement of this study probably was in March of this year, and so the data relied upon for this study is focusing on no different than what we have published on our website, what other city councils have approved for this current fiscal year, unless they made mid-year adjustments and those were captured in the data draw when we brought the consultant on. The study effectively is looking at current fiscal year prices.
Mhm.
It's hard to tell exactly how others have responded based upon the budget process, similar to what we're going through right now. And in large part, that was a consideration, especially when we came forward with the COLA recommendation, is to be aggressive and strong, largely to do everything we can to help remain competitive, especially as other agencies adjust and try to encourage employees to stay.
Definitely. All right. And then I know that we're getting the new street sweeper and the other shaker. That's what it is. And so I'm very much thankful to that. That was certainly in response to some things that I had heard over the years from our community. And I know that there's nothing in here for the code enforcement to truck along with the sweepers. Do you see that becoming part of a budget at some point?
At some point, I would say yes. And one of the critical path items that we have to look at is we need the sweeper first.
Yes.
And of course, the sweeper will supplement the reserve if we didn't want to take the other. We'll supplement the front line. We could actually pull one of the frontliners back to reserve, but we effectively can't get to that point of being able to expand into that code environment unless we have a change to the operation, which we're actually looking at operations closely after this fiscal year starts, but also to the extent there's an additional body to actually put the body, hire the body before we actually have the sweeper. We need to wait for the sweeper to actually
Gotcha.
be delivered.
All right. And then on I love the concept of creating a reserve in the Measure P fund, much as we do the general fund. I think that's wisdom. Glad to see that. As to all of the increases in employees into staffing, are we going to be able to sustain that over time?
I believe so.
Our economy is feeling a bit shaky to a lot of people. And the last thing I want to do is bring on employees and have to deliver notices not too far down the road. I just would not want to do that to anyone.
Right. And that's exactly what we're concerned about. And just as we've characterized in the modeling for Measure P in general, and you can see the healthy nature there, we actually apply that same cash flow modeling for all of our funds, and all of the funds that we actually cash flow did contain these assumptions. So we feel pretty good about being able to sustain.
Okay, and then also, well, that makes me feel good. And then I was very, very happy to see the COLA increase of 10% because, both Member Becerra and I are on a number of outside agency boards and commissions, and this issue comes up in in agreements and, annual evaluations and that kind of thing. And it's tough for everybody in every agency. It's not just cities, it's all the other agencies affiliated with them to help support. And I'm glad that we were able to do 10%. I was concerned with an increase, that much of an increase in staff, that we wouldn't get there.
I was too. When we took this on, we've gone through iteration after iteration. The fact that I invited all departments to actually look at staffing, and instead of being concerned about the number of bodies, instead more so focus on the functions and the roles and the workload. I was afraid actually that addressing the workload issue would impact our ability to afford the COLA. And fortunate enough, and I think a lot of it has to do obviously with your support as the council and your role in being fiscally responsible and supporting our effort to be fiscally responsible. And of course, the team actually doing what it needs to do to just help us get to this point. I think it's because of all of that effort and dedication to running this city fiscally prudent is what allows us to be able to make these recommendations for you.
Okay, great. And then are we planning any parks for west of 395? Because there's a lot of new housing over there that's gone up over the course of the last number of years. And it seems like, unless I'm mistaken, all of the parks are east of 395. There is one?
Yeah, there is one south of La Mesa, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yes, I know exactly where it is. Thank you. Yeah, there is one.
But the question also was there any others planned? And Ms. Davidson, are you aware of any others planned west of 395?
I'm not aware of any planned unless Mr. Webb knows of any housing developments that might have smaller pocket parks incorporated into their design. But to the extent that we were looking to add a park, we would utilize the information in our Parks and Rec master plan, which, if you recall, had sort of a heat map that we could refer to determine the best location.
And we do have approximately 3 on the west side of 395, 3 tracks that are currently in a tentative approval state.
Okay,
So if they were to develop out, yes, there would be some pocket parks associated with those. We do have a larger 10-acre park, which is further west from the current developed area. That's part of a specific plan. So that may be in the future, that may develop out as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. And then Mr. Metzler, on the issue of the body cams, is Victorville still being considered as kind of the initial rollout?
I don't know. I've certainly volunteered us, but I just don't know what that decision or how that's shaken out. I know a lot of it had to do with what infrastructure support existed within the respective communities that the sheriff is rolling those out. And I just don't know if we're among the easier, if you will, to roll those out.
Okay. And then I just have a question, because I want to make sure that I understand. And there hasn't been a change in federal law or state law, but when our hiring practices and so forth, we can't target specific genders, or we can't target specific races or any kind of preference in our hiring. Correct? Is that Title VII?
I believe that to be correct, but I'm certainly not the expert when it comes to personnel matters. So Ms. Trevino is our Human Resources Officer. Perhaps you can speak to that.
And you know what, you can get back to me, because it's not so closely, it's not tied to the budget. I just want to make sure that we're keeping ourselves above. Everyone wants to see diversity, but it has to occur within the confines of the law.
Sure, no problem. Good evening. The city of Victorville is an equal opportunity employer, of course. So we don't discriminate against any particular groups, or in our policy has always been to hire the best candidate for the position. So we do go through the process. We open the position, we advertise it as the rules and regulations state. And we allow applicants to apply for the position and go through the testing process, interview process, and the department heads will select the best candidates.
All right, thank you very much. And let me just check my list real quick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your response.
Yes, thank you.
Excuse me, Madam Mayor, I just want to chime in here. I wasn't suggesting that we target any
No.
particular person, but in terms of recruitment, where you recruit people or where you host, perhaps you attend particular job fairs where you
Mayor
might
Pro
have.
Tem? Mayor Pro
Yes.
Tem, I'm sorry, I was trying to get your
Sorry,
attention.
I somehow or another, I'm
Mayor Pro
sorry.
Tem, I need you to hold on just a moment. You have not been recognized by the chair. I will give you I understand what you just said.
I
know
just
that you were-
needed to check that. I'm sorry. Thank you.
But please in the future, make sure that you're recognized by the chair, and especially via Zoom, it makes it a little bit more challenging for everybody. I wasn't trying to infer or certainly insinuate anything. I just wanted to make sure that our audience understands that we follow the law. And I know that that's your
Of
heart's
course we
desire as
do.
well.
Of course we
Right,
do.
thank you. And let's see. Hold on one second. I got a little distracted there. All right, and so I think that concludes all of my questions, and I'm just going to say, just echo the sentiments of my council member colleagues that, this was a huge project. Budgets always are, they're months in the works. And I know that you probably don't sleep too much during the season, as do our other outside boards and agencies. And so want to thank you, Mr. Metzler, and your team for putting this together for us. We look forward to it coming to us on the 21st. And with that said, since there's no motion or discussion to take place, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn this meeting because there's no further business before us. So this meeting is adjourned. The time's 7:03.